You might have heard the old saying about how when you're going to do something, you can pick 2 out of 3 of good, fast, and cheap. If you want something good and fast, it's not going to be cheap. If you want it cheap and good, it's not going to be fast. And if you want it cheap and fast, it's probably not going to be good. But this is the cider recipe that breaks that paradigm there, because this is a good, fast, and cheap recipe. It's very inexpensive, very easy, uses actually no special brewing equipment at all. A couple of kind of brewing specific ingredients, but nothing that's hard to get, nothing expensive. And you can put this recipe together and it's ready to drink in 7 days. And I'm not kidding. If you have any kind of brewing experience at all, and you just saw this recipe, you would probably write it off, because it just looks like a typical, beginner, not very good recipe that you find on the internet, where you just take some store-bought juice, put some extra sugar in it, some yeast, let it ferment, maybe do some kind of a secondary fermentation or whatever, and drink it, and it makes something that's, maybe more or less drinkable, and it'll get you a buzz, but, not very good. And, by the time you get to the point where you're making some batches of beers and stuff like that, people generally don't mess with those kinds of recipes anymore. This is pretty much the same thing as that kind of recipe as far as the execution, but the results are way, way better than that because of some specific ingredients and the way that they work. And I discovered this pretty much by accident one day. Just decided to do a cheap little 1-gallon batch of cider just to make something quick and easy to drink when I hadn't done any brewing in quite a while. And it came out way better than I expected, and I kind of figured out afterwards why it worked that way, so I just kind of lucked upon it. And I'll show some of these ingredients here and why they work the way they do. The really important ones, I think, are the specific kind of yeast and some yeast nutrient that you're going to want to have in there. The yeast that I use is Nottingham Ale Yeast. There might be other types of yeast that will also work as well, or maybe even better, but this is one that definitely works. It definitely has the characteristics that you want. And what those characteristics are, the reason why this works so well in this recipe, is that you need a yeast with low attenuation and high flocculation. The attenuation of yeast is how aggressively it goes after and eats up the fermentable materials in your mixture. A really high attenuation yeast is like a champagne yeast that leaves a very dry finish. Not really a lot of flavor in the finished product, not really any sweetness at all, because it ate up all of that sugar that's in there. Personally, I'm not really a big fan of champagne yeast for a lot of stuff. A lot of people will use it for meads and ciders and things like that. I don't really like it because I think it comes out too dry and doesn't leave enough of the honey flavor in mead or the fruit flavors in wines or ciders, so I don't like it. What champagne yeast is actually kind of good for is a cheap and easy distilling yeast, but you didn't hear that from me. So you want a low attenuation yeast, which is, it's still going to consume most of the fermentables in there. It's not like it's, most of your sugar is going to be wasted or anything. It's going to ferment most of it still, but it will leave more sweetness, not a huge amount of sweetness, but just a little bit enough sweetness and some flavor behind. And that's what you want in a nice cider. The flocculation is the other thing, and what the flocculation is the tendency of the yeast, when it dies, basically, pretty sure, and it sinks down to the bottom of the fermenting container, it kind of settles into kind of a sticky, compacted layer that sticks together at the bottom, which makes it easier to handle later on, as we shall see. And this yeast is good for that. It tends to settle to the bottom. It's not, you know, a yeast with lower flocculation. It would tend to be, you know, all floating, and you know, you move it a little bit and you can see the yeast all swirling around off of the bottom. This is, you know, the high flocculation yeast. It, like I said, it settles, sticks to the bottom, makes it easier when we decant this after it's done fermenting, and there's less yeast floating in it for flavor, you know. So that's, you know, that's it about the yeast. Nottingham Ale Yeast is what I recommend. It's not very expensive. You can get one of these 11-gram packets. You can find them on Amazon, eBay, you know, more specialized brewing websites, or maybe your local brew shop if you have one. It's not very expensive, and one packet of this is enough to make at least 5 batches like this. So that's the yeast. The other important thing, the only other, you know, really brewing ingredient is some yeast nutrient, and this is also, you know, really easily available. Same place you could get the yeast. This is a Diamonium Phosphate yeast nutrient. You can get it everywhere. This is a little bottle that I got at a brew shop for $1.49 years ago, and it might be a little more expensive some places now. And the reason why the yeast nutrient is important is because when there is not enough nutrients for the yeast in something like this, it causes the yeast to produce more sulfur compounds, which are just kind of stinky and nasty. Makes you know, kind of a farty kind of smell. It's not good, and it's something that will show up to some degree in most things that you ferment, and it has to be gotten rid of through periods of secondary fermentation and aging after that. That's a lot of what aging entails, is allowing stuff like that to go away somewhat. So use some yeast nutrient in this, which produces a cleaner fermentation of the yeast, less of those sulfur compounds being produced, which makes for a better tasting product. And as soon as that primary fermentation is done in 5 or 6 or 7 days, it's ready to drink, and it tastes pretty good because it doesn't have that sulfur stuff in it. So that's important. Other ingredients: some brown sugar, which we will add for the additional fermentable materials. Oh, a tea bag, which I think is kind of an important addition for some tannins, which are important in cider to some extent, both for flavor, and I think it also helps the fermentation somewhat. But in professionally made cider, usually you have a blend of apples. There'll be some that are sweeter, some that are a little more tart, like crab apples that have those tannins in them, and the varieties of apples are sort of blended for specific flavor profiles, and we can sort of imitate that to some extent with our ingredients by adding some tea for tannins. Another thing is some raisins, and actually what I have here today I'm going to use as an experiment. Never tried this before. I'm going to try cranberries instead of raisins and just see how it works out. But if you're going to try this, I would suggest some raisins. Or you could skip them. They're not absolutely critical. But the raisins will add a bit of fruity complexity to it that, you know, could be gotten by mixing different varieties of apples in a, you know, proper professionally made cider. And another thing that I'm going to add that's just been kind of an experiment that I've tried a couple of times, and I like the way it's come out, is just a little bit of extra molasses. You get a little bit of that molasses flavor in brown sugar, which actually is, it's the way it's made nowadays. It's just white sugar and molasses anyways. I like to add a little bit more of that molasses flavor to it, so we'll put in some of that. I don't know, maybe a teaspoon or two. It was pretty good last time, so I'll try it again. I'll maybe put in a little more than last time.